The 1960s remained, for many of us, a time remembered less for specific dates or headlines, and more for a particular rhythm of living that seemed, even then, unremarkable. It was an era when time did not announce itself loudly, when days unfolded with a quiet predictability that allowed people to inhabit them fully. We did not speak of pace or balance because life moved at what felt like a natural speed, one that aligned effortlessly with human habits, physical limits, and shared expectations. Looking back now, what stands out is not the absence of hardship or uncertainty, but the presence of a collective understanding that life would take the time it required, and that this in itself was sufficient. In those days, mornings often began without urgency. The day revealed itself gradually, through light filtering into rooms, through familiar sounds that marked the passage from sleep to wakefulness. We rose knowing roughly what awaited us, not because life lacked surprises, but because routines provided a stable framework within which variation could exist. Breakfast was not a transaction but a moment, shaped by repetition and familiarity. Simple gestures carried meaning not because they were consciously assigned importance, but because they were repeated day after day, becoming part of a shared language of living. Domestic spaces reflected this unspoken order. Homes were arranged for use rather than display, and objects carried the marks of handling and time. Furniture remained in place for years, sometimes decades, accumulating stories rather than being replaced for novelty. The sound of a radio in the background, the ticking of clock, the hum of everyday activity, formed a continuous backdrop against which life proceeded. Silence, too, had its place, accepted without discomfort, filling rooms without the need to be explained or avoided. Social interactions followed a similar pattern of steadiness. People encounter one another regularly and in predictable settings, not through scheduling but through shared routines. Conversations unfolded at an unhurried pace, shaped as much by pauses as by words. We listened because there was time to listen, and we spoke without the pressure of immediate response. Even disagreements moved within established boundaries, guided by an understanding that relationships endure beyond any single exchange. Much of what we learned during that period was absorbed indirectly. Instruction rarely took the form of explicit explanation. Instead, values were demonstrated through behavior, through choices made repeatedly in ordinary circumstances. We learned patience by observing how others waited, responsibility by watching tasks completed without complaint, respect by noticing how people address one another. These lessons did not announce themselves as lessons. They were simply part of the environment, absorbed gradually and almost unconsciously. Work, too, followed a rhythm that allowed for continuity. Many of us associated our working lives with a limited number of places and roles, often maintained over long stretches of time. Skills were developed through repetition and proximity, rather than constant reinvention. There was dignity in familiarity, in knowing not only how to perform a task, but when to perform it and when to stop. The boundary between work and rest was not sharply drawn, but was understood, shaped by shared expectations rather than formal rules. Leisure did not present itself as an escape from life, but as an extension of it. Free time was woven naturally into the structure of days and weeks, emerging without being formally designated. Evenings offered opportunities for quiet activity, for conversation, for simple forms of entertainment that required presence rather than stimulation. There was pleasure in doing little, in allowing time to pass without demanding that it produce something measurable. Public spaces played a central role in reinforcing this sense of continuity. Streets, shops, and communal areas were familiar rather than interchangeable. We recognized faces not because we knew names, but because repeated encounters created a sense of belonging. These environments did not demand attention. They accommodated it. Movement through them followed established patterns that rarely needed to be questioned or revised. Technology existed, of course, but occupied a more modest position in daily life. Devices were tools rather than companions, used for specific purposes and then set aside. Their limitations were accepted as part of their nature, and waiting was not considered an inconvenience, but an expected component of use. The absence of immediacy shaped behavior subtly, encouraging planning, patience, and a tolerance for delay. Communication reflected this measured approach. Messages took time to arrive, and responses unfolded accordingly. The gap between intention and fulfillment was not perceived as empty space to be filled, but as a natural interval during which other aspects of life continued uninterrupted. Anticipation carried its own quiet satisfaction, allowing emotions to settle and expectations to remain flexible. There was, throughout this period, a prevailing sense of continuity between generations. Knowledge, habits, and customs were transmitted through shared experience rather than deliberate preservation. We did not speak of legacy, yet it was constantly being formed through everyday actions. Children observed adults not as examples to be emulated consciously, but as models of how life was lived. Over time, these observations shaped attitudes and behaviors that felt less like inheritance and more like instinct. Change occurred, as it always does, but it arrived gradually enough to be absorbed without disruption. Innovations entered daily life not as replacements for existing practices, but as additions that found their place alongside them. The past was not discarded to make room for the new. Instead, it coexisted, providing reference points that grounded experience. This layering of time contributed to a sense of stability that did not depend on stasis, but on continuity. Looking back, it becomes clear that much of what defined that era was not consciously chosen. We did not set out to live deliberately slower lives. We simply lived within structures that allowed for slowness. The absence of constant acceleration created space for reflection without requiring it. Life offered moments of intensity and urgency, but these were exceptions rather than the norm, standing out precisely because they contrasted with an underlying steadiness. Memory preserves these qualities not as a catalog of events, but as a texture of experience. We recall the feeling of time moving evenly, of days shaped by repetition rather than interruption. This recollection is not tinged with longing for return, but with recognition of a way of living that once seemed ordinary. Its significance emerges only in retrospect, as we compare it to the heightened awareness of pace that characterizes later periods. The 1960s, for many of us, remain associated with a sense of being present without effort. We inhabited our lives without constant self-observation, guided by routines that required little explanation. This presence did not eliminate uncertainty or difficulty, but provided a stable foundation from which to face them. In remembering this, we are reminded not of what has been lost, but of what once felt natural and therefore invisible at the time. As the days unfolded during that decade, there was a shared understanding that life was something to be entered into fully rather than managed from a distance. Time did not fragment itself into competing demands, but stretched gently, allowing attention to settle where it was needed. Many of us remember how hours seemed broader then, not because clocks moved differently, but because our relationship with them was less anxious. We trusted that there would be enough time to complete what mattered, and this trust shaped how we moved through our days. Meals, for instance, were moments of gathering rather than interruptions between tasks. They followed recognizable patterns, often tied to the same hours each day, and their preparation carried a sense of continuity. Recipes were rarely written down with precision. They lived in memory and gesture, adjusted slightly according to circumstance. The act of eating together reinforced bonds without commentary. Conversation flowed naturally, sometimes animated, sometimes quiet, shaped by the simple fact of sharing space and food. The passage of seasons was felt directly, not as an abstract cycle but as a physical presence. Changes in light, temperature, and routine marked time more clearly than calendars. Clothing shifted gradually, stored away and retrieved with familiarity rather than replaced. Seasonal habits returned each year, bringing with them a sense of reassurance. We did not need to be reminded of these transitions. They announced themselves through everyday experience. Children grew up within this steady framework, learning not through constant instruction but through immersion. Play unfolded without rigid scheduling, guided by curiosity and circumstance. There was room for boredom, which in turn made space for imagination. Adults observed from a distance, intervening only when necessary, trusting that experience itself would teach resilience and judgment. This trust was not articulated, but it was deeply felt. Education extended beyond formal settings. Schools had their place, but much learning occurred through observation and participation in daily life. Skills were passed along informally, through shared tasks and quiet demonstration. The absence of constant evaluation allowed confidence to develop slowly, rooted in familiarity rather than performance. Progress was measured over years rather than moments. Public life reflected similar values. Civic rituals, whether formal or informal, provided a sense of belonging without demanding constant attention. People showed up because it was expected, and expectation itself was a form of commitment. Participation did not require enthusiasm to be declared. Presence was enough. Over time, this repeated participation fostered a quiet sense of responsibility towards shared spaces and institutions. Transportation, 2. Shaped daily rhythms in subtle ways. Travel required planning and patience, reinforcing the idea that movement was an experience rather than convenience. Journeys unfolded at a pace that allowed observation, creating continuity between departure and arrival. The act of going somewhere carried weight, not because distance was greater, but because effort was involved. This effort lent meaning to arrival. Even communication at a distance carried the sense of deliberation. Words were chosen carefully, not because of self-consciousness, but because opportunities to communicate were fewer and therefore valued. Silence between exchanges was not interpreted as absence, but as part of the relationship. The waiting itself became a form of connection, allowing thoughts to mature before being shared. Within families, roles were understood through repetition rather than negotiation. Expectations were rarely discussed explicitly, yet they guided behavior consistently. This did not eliminate conflict, but it provided a common reference point from which disagreements could be addressed. Authority, where it existed, was expressed quietly, reinforced by consistency rather than force. Leisure activities reflected an appreciation for continuity and presence. Entertainment required participation rather than consumption, drawing people together in shared experience. Music, games, and conversation filled evenings without demanding constant novelty. Familiarity enhanced enjoyment, allowing deeper engagement over time. Repetition was not seen as stagnation, but as an opportunity to refine experience. The material world supported this rhythm. Objects were designed to last, repair when possible, and valued for their reliability. Ownership carried responsibility, encouraging care and maintenance. This relationship with possessions fostered patience and attentiveness, reinforcing the idea that usefulness outweighed appearance. Over time, objects became companions in daily life, accumulating meaning through shared history. Workplaces mirrored these values in their own way. Hierarchies existed, but they were tempered by familiarity and long-term association. Colleagues knew one another beyond functional roles, creating a sense of mutual dependence. Advancement came gradually, often tied to longevity as much as achievement. This gradualism fostered loyalty and stability, even as it limited rapid change. There was, throughout this period, an acceptance of limits. Physical, temporal, and social boundaries were recognized and respected, not as constraints to be overcome, but as conditions within which life unfolded. This acceptance reduced friction, allowing energy to be directed toward living rather than constant adjustment. Limits provided structure, and structure, in turn, supported freedom of a particular kind. As years passed, these patterns reinforced themselves, becoming almost invisible through familiarity. We did not perceive them as choices, but as the natural order of things. Only later, when rhythms began to shift and acceleration became more pronounced, did these earlier patterns stand out as distinctive. At the time, they simply formed the backdrop against which individual lives were lived. Memory returns to these moments not as isolated scenes, but as a continuous atmosphere. We recall the sense of time moving steadily, of life unfolding without constant interruption. This recollection carries no demand to recreate the past, but invites reflection on conditions that once made such steadiness possible. In remembering, we recognize a mode of living shaped less by intention than by circumstance, and therefore all the more powerful in its quiet influence. The second half of that decade would bring changes that hinted at new directions, yet even then, the underlying rhythm persisted. Transitions occur within an existing framework, allowing adaptation without rupture. The continuity of daily life provided a buffer against uncertainty, reinforcing a collective sense of resilience grounded in shared experience rather than explicit preparation. In reflecting on this period, we come to understand that its defining qualities were not the result of idealization, but of alignment between human capacities and social structures. Life followed a pace that felt manageable, not because it was simpler, but because it allowed space for attention, repetition, and gradual change. This alignment fostered a sense of ease that, at the time, required no explanation. As the years progressed, the quiet structure of daily life continued to assert itself through countless small details that rarely demanded reflection at the time. Many of us recall how mornings, afternoons, and evenings each carried their own character, not through formal scheduling, but through habit and repetition. The day had a shape that was widely understood, and within that shape, individual lives unfolded with a sense of coherence that rarely needed to be named. Morning hours were often associated with preparation and intention. The act of beginning the day carried a quiet seriousness, even when tasks themselves were modest. There was an understanding that how one started the day mattered, not because it determined success in measurable terms, but because it set a tone. Movements were deliberate, unhurried, shaped by familiarity. The same gestures repeated each morning provided a sense of grounding, a reminder that the day ahead belonged to a larger continuum rather than standing alone. As the day moved forward, activity increased naturally, following patterns that were both personal and collective. Work, errands, and responsibilities interwove without competing aggressively for attention. Transitions between activities were marked by physical movement rather than digital signals, allowing the mind to adjust gradually. The absence of constant interruption created a mental continuity that supported focus without strain. Attention rested where it was placed, free from the expectation of immediate redirection. Afternoons often brought a subtle shift in energy. The pace softened slightly, making room for reflection even as obligations continued. There was an acceptance of fluctuation, an understanding that energy ebbed and flowed naturally. Rest was not framed as a reward, nor was productivity treated as a moral imperative. Instead, balance emerged organically through listening to the rhythms of the body and the day. Evenings, in turn, offered a sense of closure. The gradual winding down of activity signaled a transition that was both physical and emotional. Lights softened, conversation slowed, and the day released its hold. This transition was not abrupt, nor was it mediated by constant distraction. It unfolded through routine, allowing the mind to settle. Sleep, when it came, felt like a continuation rather than an escape. Within this daily rhythm, relationships developed depth through proximity and repetition. We saw the same people regularly, not through deliberate maintenance, but because shared routines brought us together. Familiarity bred understanding, and understanding fostered tolerance. Differences were absorbed into the fabric of daily interaction rather than amplified. Over time, this created a sense of mutual recognition that extended beyond personal affection. Language itself reflected this steadiness. Speech was shaped by context and audience, not by the need to assert presence. Silence was respected as a form of communication, carrying meaning without requiring interpretation. Listening was an active practice, supported by the absence of competing stimuli. Words found their place within conversations that unfolded without urgency. The physical environment reinforced these patterns. Neighborhoods retained their character through continuity of use rather than constant redesign. Streets bore the marks of regular passage, and buildings aged visibly, carrying the imprint of time. This visible aging was not perceived as decline, but as evidence of endurance. The environment told a story that unfolded gradually, inviting familiarity rather than surprise. Daily transactions reflected a similar ethos. Exchanges were personal rather than automated, grounded in recognition and routine. Trust developed through repeated interaction, reducing the need for constant verification. This trust was not naive. It was built slowly, reinforced through experience. Over time, it formed the basis of social cohesion, allowing life to proceed with minimal friction. In moments of difficulty, this cohesion provided quiet support. Challenges were met within an existing network of relationships and expectations. Assistance was offered without fanfare, received without embarrassment. The absence of spectacle allowed dignity to be preserved on all sides. Problems were addressed incrementally, without the pressure to resolve them instantly or completely. Time itself was experienced less as a resource to be managed and more as a medium through which life unfolded. Waiting was accepted as a natural component of experience, providing space for thought and anticipation. Delays did not automatically generate frustration. They were absorbed into the flow of the day. This acceptance softened the edges of uncertainty, making patience a shared practice rather than an individual virtue. Generational continuity remained a defining feature of this period. Older and younger people shared spaces and routines, allowing knowledge to pass quietly between them. The presence of multiple generations within daily life reinforced a sense of perspective, reminding us that individual moments were part of a larger sequence. This awareness tempered both ambition and disappointment, situating personal experience within a broader context. Change, when it came, was often subtle enough to be integrated without disruption. New ideas and practices entered daily life gradually, finding their place alongside existing ones. The absence of constant novelty allowed discernment to develop, enabling people to choose what to adopt and what to set aside. This selective integration preserved continuity, while allowing for evolution. Memory returns to these years not as a collection of dramatic events, but as a sustained atmosphere of steadiness. We recall the feeling of being carried forward by routines that required little conscious effort. This steadiness did not eliminate conflict or hardship, but provided a stable framework within which they could be addressed. The result was a sense of resilience rooted in continuity rather than control. As we reflect on this period, we recognize that its defining quality lay in the alignment between human experience and social tempo. Life moved at a pace that allowed observation, repetition, and gradual change to shape understanding. This pace did not demand constant awareness. It operated quietly in the background, supporting daily life without drawing attention to itself. In remembering, we do not idealize the past or seek to return to it. Instead, we acknowledge a way of living that once felt natural, precisely because it did not need to be articulated. Its significance emerges only with distance, as we compare it to later rhythms that require constant negotiation. The memory serves not as prescription, but as a reminder of what becomes possible when time is allowed to move gently, carrying life forward without haste. As the decade advanced, the sense of continuity that shaped daily life extended beyond individual routines and into broader fabric of community. Many of us recall how belonging was not something to be actively sought, but something that emerged naturally through repeated presence. One belonged because one was there day after day, participating in the same rhythms as others. This shared participation created bonds that were rarely discussed yet deeply felt. Communities were not defined solely by geography, but by habit. People encounter one another through ordinary activities, and these encounters accumulated meaning over time. Recognition preceded familiarity, and familiarity gradually gave rise to trust. There was no expectation of constant affirmation. Acknowledgement itself carried weight. A nod, a brief exchange, or even shared silence reinforced the sense that one was part of a larger whole. Customs played a quiet but significant role in maintaining this cohesion. They were not rigid rules imposed from above, but practices shaped by repetition and mutual understanding. Observing them did not require explanation. Participation was enough. Through these customs, individuals learn how to move within shared spaces, how to balance personal needs with collective expectations. The absence of explicit instruction allowed flexibility, ensuring that customs remained living practices rather than static traditions. Celebrations, when they occurred, followed the same understated approach. They were woven into the calendar without overwhelming it, providing moments of shared recognition rather than spectacle. Preparation unfolded gradually, often involving familiar tasks repeated year after year. The meaning of these occasions lay not in their novelty, but in their predictability. They offered reassurance, reminding participants that time continued to move forward within a stable framework. Even moments of loss or difficulty were approached with similar restraint. Public expressions of grief were tempered by an understanding of privacy and respect. Support was offered through presence rather than display, allowing individuals to process experience at their own pace. This balance between communal support and personal space reflected a broader respect for emotional boundaries that characterized the period. The relationship between individuals and institutions was shaped by familiarity rather than abstraction. Schools, workplaces, and local organizations were staffed by people known personally, blurring the line between role and individual. Authority was exercised through continuity and recognition rather than anonymity. This personal dimension fostered accountability on all sides, grounding institutional life in human relationships. Information traveled more slowly, and this slowness shaped how it was received. News arrived as part of a daily rhythm, often accompanied by conversation and reflection. The interval between events and their discussion allowed perspective to develop. Reactions unfolded over time, moderated by context and shared experience. This gradual processing reduced the sense of immediacy that can amplify uncertainty. The physical act of gathering information required intention. Reading, listening, and observing demanded presence, encouraging engagement rather than passive consumption. Over time, this engagement cultivated discernment, enabling individuals to place events within a broader narrative rather than reacting to them in isolation. Understanding developed incrementally, shaped by repetition and dialogue. Within households, responsibilities were distributed through habit rather than negotiation. Tasks were learned by doing, reinforced through repetition rather than instruction. This approach fostered a sense of contribution that did not require recognition. The satisfaction derived from completing familiar tasks reinforced self-worth quietly, without the need for external validation. The material simplicity of daily life supported this sense of sufficiency. Needs were understood within a limited range, reducing the pressure to acquire constantly. Possessions served clear purposes, and their maintenance became part of routine. This relationship of material goods encouraged care and attentiveness, reinforcing the idea that value lay in use rather than accumulation. Time spent alone was accepted as a natural complement to social life. Solitude did not carry stigma, nor did it require justification. It provided space for reflection and rest, allowing individuals to reconnect with themselves without feeling isolated. This balance between togetherness and solitude supported emotional resilience, enabling people to navigate change without losing grounding. As children grew into adults within this environment, they carried forward patterns absorbed through experience rather than instruction. These patterns shaped expectations subtly, influencing how they approached work, relationships, and responsibility. The continuity between generations was not enforced. It emerged organically through shared living. Differences were accommodated within a framework of mutual recognition. Looking back, we recognize that much of the stability depended on a shared acceptance of gradual change. Progress was not defined by speed, but by integration. New practices were adopted when they proved useful, not simply because they were new. This cautious openness allowed innovation to coexist with tradition, preserving continuity while allowing adaptation. Memory preserves these qualities not as rigid ideals, but as a lived experience marked by balance. We recall a time when life felt anchored, not because it was free of challenge, but because it unfolded within structures that supported attention and patience. These structures did not eliminate uncertainty, but they provided a reliable context within which it could be faced. As the decade moved on, subtle shifts began to signal new directions. Yet even as change gathered momentum, the underlying rhythm persisted, offering a sense of continuity that softened transition. This persistence reminds us that the pace of life is shaped not only by external forces, but by shared agreement about how time is used and valued. In reflecting on this period, we come to see how deeply these agreements influence daily experience. They were rarely articulated, yet they governed behavior consistently. The result was a form of collective ease, born not of complacency, but of alignment between human needs and social structures. The memory of that alignment remains with us, not as a standard to be imposed, but as a reference point. It invites us to consider how pace, continuity, and presence shape experience over time. In remembering how life once followed a more human rhythm without drawing attention to itself, we gain insight into the quiet forces that sustain meaning across generations. As the familiar patterns of daily life continue to assert themselves, many of us experienced a growing awareness of time not as something to be measured, but as something to be inhabited. The passing of years did not announce itself dramatically. It revealed itself through accumulation. We notice it in subtle changes, in the way routines adapted almost imperceptibly, in the quiet deepening of experience that came from doing the same things repeatedly, yet never quite in the same way. There was comfort in this repetition, not because it eliminated uncertainty, but because it provided a stable reference against which change could be understood. We learn to recognize variation within sameness, to appreciate the small differences that distinguish one day from another. This attentiveness fostered patience, allowing meaning to emerge gradually rather than being demanded immediately. Life did not need to explain itself. It unfolded in its own time. Domestic life remained central to this experience. Homes function as anchors, offering continuity amid external change. The arrangement of rooms, the placement of objects, and the rhythms of household activity created an environment that supported both activity and rest. These spaces were shaped by use rather than design, evolving slowly as needs changed. The resulting familiarity allowed inhabitants to move through their days with ease, supported by surroundings that required little adjustment. The care of these spaces was integrated into daily life rather than set apart as a separate concern. Cleaning, maintenance, and organization followed regular patterns, reinforcing a sense of stewardship. These tasks were not framed as burdens, but as contributions to a shared environment. Over time, they became expressions of responsibility, reinforcing the idea that care was a continuous practice rather than occasional effort. Social expectations reflected similar values. Courtesy and consideration were expressed through consistent behavior rather than formal etiquette. Politeness did not require elaboration. It was embedded in tone, gesture, and timing. Waiting one's turn, allowing space for others, and acknowledging presence were habits learned through observation and reinforced through repetition. These small acts accumulated, shaping interactions in ways that felt natural rather than imposed. The pace of public life allowed for observation as well as participation. One could watch without feeling excluded, listen without needing to respond immediately. This flexibility accommodated different temperaments, allowing individuals to engage according to their capacity at any given moment. The absence of constant demand created room for reflection, enabling people to absorb experience before reacting to it. Learning continued throughout life, often without formal recognition. Skills were refined through practice, understanding deepened through exposure, and judgment developed through experience. This process was gradual and largely invisible, unfolding over years rather than moments. The lack of constant assessment allowed individuals to grow at their own pace, fostering confidence grounded in competence rather than comparison. The broader social landscape mirrored this gradualism. Changes in fashion, language, and custom occurred incrementally, allowing continuity to coexist with adaptation. New influences entered daily life without displacing established ones, creating a layered cultural environment. This layering provided depth, connecting present experience to past reference points. The result was a sense of belonging that extended across time as well as space. Work remained an important source of identity, yet it rarely consumed the entirety of one's sense of self. Roles were understood within a broader context of life, balanced by family, community, and personal interests. This balance did not require constant negotiation. It was embedded in social expectations that recognized the limits of sustained effort. Rest and activity complemented one another, reinforcing resilience rather than undermining it. Even ambition was shaped by this framework. Goals were pursued steadily, often over long periods, without the expectation of immediate fulfillment. Success was measured through durability rather than visibility, through contribution rather than recognition. This approach fostered perseverance, allowing individuals to remain engaged even when progress was slow. Achievement, when it came, felt integrated into life rather than standing apart from it. The relationship between past and present was experienced as continuity rather than contrast. Memories were not compartmentalized as separate from current experience. They informed it quietly, providing context and perspective. Stories were shared not to preserve the past as an object, but to integrate it into ongoing life. This integration allowed individuals to locate themselves within a larger narrative without feeling constrained by it. Silence played an important role in sustaining this continuity. Pauses in conversation, moments of stillness, and intervals of waiting were accepted as meaningful components of experience. They provided space for thought and emotional processing, allowing understanding to deepen. Silence was not perceived as absence, but as presence in another form, carrying its own weight and significance. As the decade progressed, subtle tensions emerged between established rhythms and emerging pressures. Yet these tensions were absorbed gradually, mediated by habits that prioritized continuity. Adjustments were made without abandoning core practices, allowing life to remain recognizable even as it evolved. This capacity for adaptation, without rupture, reflected a collective confidence rooted in experience. In reflecting on this period, we recognize how deeply these patterns shaped our perception of what was normal. The absence of constant urgency allowed attention to settle, enabling deeper engagement with daily life. This engagement fostered a sense of sufficiency, reducing the impulse to seek fulfillment elsewhere. Life, as it was lived, felt adequate without requiring constant enhancement. The memory of this adequacy remained significant, not as a standard to be enforced, but as a reference point. It reminds us that fulfillment can arise from alignment rather than accumulation, from continuity rather than acceleration. In recalling how life once unfolded at a pace that felt human, we gain insight into conditions that support meaning over time. As we continue to reflect, the image that emerges is not a static past, but a living process shaped by repetition, patience, and shared understanding. These qualities did not eliminate difficulty, but they provided a stable context within which it could be faced. The result was a form of resilience grounded in everyday practice rather than abstract ideals. This resilience, quietly cultivated, carried many of us forward into subsequent years. It informed how we responded to change, how we evaluated progress, and how we understood our place within a broader continuum. In remembering the steady rhythm of those days, we are reminded that life does not always need to move quickly to move forward. As the rhythm of life continued to carry us forward, many of us became increasingly aware of how deeply habits shaped our sense of stability. These habits were not rigid routines imposed from outside, but patterns that emerged naturally through repetition and shared understanding. They provided orientation, allowing us to move through days and years with a sense of direction that did not depend on constant decision-making. In this way, habit became a form of quiet guidance, supporting continuity without limiting freedom. Daily choices were often made within a narrow range of possibilities, and this limitation proved surprisingly liberating. With fewer options to evaluate, attention could settle more fully on what was present. We learned to recognize quality through familiarity rather than comparison, developing discernment grounded in experience. Satisfaction arose not from abundance, but from adequacy, from the feeling that what was available was enough for the moment. This sense of sufficiency extended into emotional life as well. Feelings were acknowledged without being endlessly analyzed or displayed. Joy, disappointment, pride, and worry were understood as part of the natural ebb and flow of experience. There was no expectation that emotions needed to be optimized or constantly expressed. Instead, they were allowed to pass through daily life, finding their place within a broader context of routine and responsibility. Conversation reflected this emotional economy. Words were used carefully, shaped by context and relationship. We did not feel compelled to fill every silence or articulate every thought. Listening was valued as much as speaking, and understanding often emerged gradually, through tone and timing as much as through content. This restraint fostered mutual respect, allowing conversations to unfold without pressure. The passage of time reinforced these patterns through repetition. Birthdays, anniversaries, and other markers arrived quietly, recognized without spectacle. Their significance lay not in celebration alone, but in continuity, in a reminder that life progressed steadily from one stage to another. These markers offered moments of reflection, allowing individuals to situate themselves in the flow of years without urgency. Work continued to provide structure, but it rarely defined totality of identity. Even those deeply committed to their roles understood them as part of a larger life. The end of the working day marked a transition that was respected, allowing attention to shift toward other responsibilities and pleasures. This boundary supported balance, preventing any single domain from overwhelming the rest. The physical act of ending the day carried symbolic weight. Tools were set aside, spaces were restored to order, and the environment shifted toward rest. These gestures signaled closure, allowing the mind to release its focus. Over time, this rhythm reinforced a sense of completion, reducing the accumulation of unresolved tension. The built environment supported these transitions through its scale and familiarity. Spaces were designed for human use rather than constant adaptation, encouraging regular patterns of movement and rest. The absence of constant redesign allowed places to acquire character, reinforcing attachment and belonging. Over time, these environments became repositories of memory, holding traces of countless ordinary moments. Social expectations reinforced continuity through consistency. Reliability was valued, and commitments were honored quietly, without the need for constant affirmation. Trust developed slowly, built through repeated experience rather than formal assurance. This trust reduced friction, allowing interactions to proceed smoothly. When misunderstandings occurred, they were addressed within an existing framework of relationship, minimizing disruption. The concept of progress during this period was closely tied to endurance. Improvement was understood as something that unfolded over time, requiring patience and persistence. Sudden transformation was neither expected nor desired. This perspective encouraged long-term thinking, fostering decisions that prioritize stability alongside growth. Within families, this long-term perspective shaped relationships across generations. Elders were regarded as sources of experience rather than authority alone. Their presence offered continuity, connecting present life to past practice. Younger generations absorbed this continuity through observation, integrating it into their own developing identities. This transmission occurred quietly, without formal instruction, reinforcing a sense of belonging within a larger sequence. As individuals aged, their relationship with time evolved naturally. Youth gave way to maturity without abrupt redefinition. Roles shifted gradually, allowing identity to adapt without rupture. This gradual transition supported emotional continuity, reducing the sense of loss often associated with change. Life stages flowed into one another, connected by shared experience rather than sharp boundaries. Public discourse reflected similar restraint. Differences of opinion existed, but they were framed within a shared commitment to continuity. Debate unfolded within established norms, emphasizing respect and restraint. This approach did not eliminate disagreement, but it limited escalation, preserving social cohesion even amid change. The pace of innovation remained measured, allowing society to integrate new developments thoughtfully. Change was evaluated through lived experience rather than theoretical promise. This cautious approach reduced disruption, enabling people to adapt gradually. Familiar practices were not abandoned lightly. They were adjusted only when necessary, preserving continuity. Memory, looking back on this period, captures not dramatic transformation, but steady progression. We recall the feeling of being carried forward by routines that provided orientation and support. This memory is not one of perfection, but a balance of a life lived within human limits. Its significance lies in its ordinariness, in the way it allowed meaning to emerge through repetition. As later years would demonstrate, such balance is neither automatic nor guaranteed. It depends on shared agreements about pace, responsibility, and attention. During this period, those agreements were largely implicit, reinforced through daily practice rather than formal articulation. Their effectiveness lay precisely in this implicitness, in their ability to guide behavior without drawing attention to themselves. Reflecting on these years, we recognize how deeply they shaped our expectations of life. They taught us to value steadiness, to trust gradual change, and to find meaning in continuity. These lessons were not delivered through instruction, but through experience, absorbed quietly over time. The memory of that experience remains with us, informing how we perceive subsequent change. It offers a reference point, reminding us that life can unfold at a pace that feels aligned with human capacities. In recalling this, we do not seek to idealize the past, but to understand the conditions that once allowed such alignment to exist. As the sense of continuity deepened, many of us came to understand that stability was not the absence of movement, but a particular way of moving through time. Life advanced steadily, shaped by repetition that allowed meaning to accumulate rather than disperse. We did not experience this as stagnation, but as a form of quiet progress, where each day contributed incrementally to a larger whole. The passage of weeks and months was marked by familiarity rather than novelty. Certain days resembled those that came before, yet each carried subtle distinctions. These distinctions were not always noticed consciously, but they registered over time, creating texture within routine. This texture allowed memory to form not around isolated events, but around sustained experience, giving depth to recollection. Attention was directed outward as much as inward. We noticed changes in weather, in light in the behavior of others, and these observations anchored us in the present moment. The world offered enough variation to remain engaging without overwhelming attention. This balance supported a form of awareness that was both relaxed and attentive, allowing us to participate fully without constant vigilance. The relationship between effort and reward was understood in long terms. Results were expected to emerge gradually, shaped by consistent application rather than sudden breakthrough. This understanding fostered perseverance, encouraging individuals to remain committed even when progress was not immediately visible. The absence of constant feedback allowed motivation to be sustained internally, grounded in purpose rather than validation. Domestic routines continue to provide a foundation for this perseverance. Repeated tasks, performed day after day, created a sense of order that extended beyond the home. These routines reinforce reliability, both personal and collective. Knowing that certain things will be done and done in familiar ways reduced uncertainty, allowing attention to be directed toward other concerns. Within this framework, relationships matured through shared time rather than dramatic expression. Affection and loyalty were demonstrated through presence, through showing up consistently rather than declaring intent. Over time, this consistency built trust, creating bonds that could withstand periods of difficulty or distance. The strength of these bonds lay in their quiet durability. Communication remained measured, shaped by context and consideration. Words were chosen with awareness of their impact, and restraint was valued alongside clarity. This approach did not suppress expression. It refined it, allowing meaning to emerge through precision rather than volume. Silence continued to serve as a companion to speech, providing space for reflection and understanding. Public life mirrored these values through its emphasis on continuity. Institutions evolved slowly, guided by experience rather than theory alone. Policies and practices were adjusted incrementally, allowing time for evaluation. This cautious approach reduced disruption, preserving social cohesion even as circumstances changed. The experience of waiting remained central to this way of life. Waiting was not framed as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be accepted. It created intervals within which anticipation and reflection could occur. These intervals softened the impact of uncertainty, allowing individuals to adjust expectations gradually rather than abruptly. As individuals age within this environment, their relationship with time continued to evolve. Youthful urgency gave way to a more measured perspective, shaped by accumulated experience. This shift did not diminish engagement. It deepened it, allowing participation to be informed by understanding rather than impulse. Life stages were not sharply delineated. They flowed into one another, connected by continuity of habit and relationship. The sense of belonging that emerged from this continuity extended beyond immediate relationships. It encompassed place, tradition, and shared memory. Familiar landscapes and routines reinforce identity, providing a stable backdrop against which individual lives unfolded. This stability supported resilience, enabling people to navigate change without losing orientation. Reflection, when it occurred, was integrated into daily life rather than set apart. Moments of thought arose naturally during routine activities, allowing insight to develop gradually. There was no expectation that reflection needed to produce immediate conclusions. Understanding was allowed to emerge over time, shaped by experience rather than analysis alone. The gradual accumulation of experience fostered humility. We recognize the limits of knowledge and control, accepting uncertainty as part of life. This acceptance reduced anxiety, allowing individuals to focus on what could be done rather than what could not be predicted. Confidence arose not from mastery, but from familiarity with uncertainty itself. As the decade moved forward, the foundations laid by these habits continued to support daily life. Even as new influences appeared, the underlying rhythm persisted, providing continuity amid change. This persistence was not enforced. It emerged naturally from shared practice and expectation. Memory returns to this period with a sense of calm recognition. We recall the feeling of being supported by routines that did not demand constant attention. This memory is not one of perfection, but of alignment, of a life lived within human limits. Its value lies in its ordinariness, in the way it allowed meaning to develop quietly over time. In remembering, we do not seek to replicate the past, but to understand it. The The pace of life during those years reflected a balance between activity and rest, between continuity and change. This balance was not achieved through deliberate design, but through shared agreement and practice. Its effects were subtle yet enduring, shaping experience in ways that become visible only with distance. As we carry these memories forward, they inform how we perceive later developments. They provide a reference point, reminding us that life can unfold at a pace that feels natural, supported by routines that allow attention and patience to flourish. In acknowledging this, we gain insight into the quiet conditions that once made such a way of living possible. As time moved forward, the quiet confidence that had characterized everyday life continued to express itself through an unspoken trust in continuity. Many of us sensed that life did not need constant supervision to hold together. There was a belief, rarely articulated, that things would proceed as they had before, not because change was impossible, but because stability was understood as the default condition. This belief shaped attitudes subtly, encouraging patience and reducing the impulse to intervene unnecessarily. The flow of days retained its familiar structure, and within that structure, individuals learned to recognize moments that mattered without needing them to be highlighted. Significance was not always attached to extraordinary events, but often to ordinary repetitions that gradually took on meaning. A familiar route walked countless times, a task performed routinely, a conversation revisited in small variations. These experiences accumulated quietly, forming the substance of memory. The sense of time passing gently was reinforced by the way attention was distributed. There was no expectation that every moment needed to be filled or optimized. Empty spaces in the day were accepted without discomfort, providing room for thought, observation, and rest. These spaces did not feel wasted. They felt necessary, allowing life to breathe between commitments. Relationships continued to be shaped by proximity and duration rather than constant exchange. We did not measure connection by frequency of contact alone, but by the assurance that it endured over time. Distance, whether physical or temporal, did not automatically weaken bonds. The knowledge that one could resume where one had left off provided reassurance, reducing the need for continual reinforcement. The pace of correspondence reflected this understanding. Messages were sent with the expectation that they would be received and answered in due course. The interval between sending and receiving was not experienced as a gap to be filled, but as a natural pause. This pause allowed anticipation to develop, adding depth to communication. Meaning was shaped not only by content, but by timing. Within families, this acceptance of timing influenced how milestones were approached. Growth, achievement, and change were acknowledged without excessive pressure. Expectations were framed broadly, allowing individuals to develop according to their own rhythm. Success was recognized, but it was not treated as a measure of worth. This perspective fostered resilience, enabling people to navigate setbacks without feeling defined by them. Work continued to be integrated into this broader view of life. Effort was valued, but exhaustion was not celebrated. There was an understanding that sustained contribution required balance, that energy needed to be renewed as well as expended. This understanding shaped daily schedules, reinforcing the importance of rest as a component of productivity rather than its opposite. Public life reflected a similar balance. Participation was encouraged, but withdrawal was respected. Individuals could engage actively or observe quietly without judgment. This flexibility allowed diverse forms of involvement, accommodating different temperaments and circumstances. Community did not demand uniformity. It accommodated variation within shared norms. The material environment continued to support this way of living through its durability and familiarity. Objects remained in use long enough to become part of daily rhythm, reducing the need for constant adaptation. Repair and maintenance were integrated into routine, reinforcing attentiveness and care. This relationship with material things fostered patience, reminding us that value often emerges over time. As people aged, the continuity of these practices provided a sense of coherence. The transition from one stage of life to another unfolded gradually, supported by familiar routines and relationships. Identity evolved without rupture, shaped by accumulated experience rather than abrupt redefinition. This gradualism softened the emotional impact of change, allowing individuals to remain grounded even as circumstances shifted. The collective memory of earlier years continued to inform present behavior. Past experiences were not held at a distance. They were woven into ongoing life through stories, habits, and expectations. This integration provided perspective, reminding us that current challenges were part of a longer sequence. The past offered reference points rather than prescriptions, guiding action without constraining it. Moments of uncertainty were approached with a degree of calm rooted in this perspective. The belief that life had endured before and would continue to endure tempered anxiety. Solutions were sought incrementally, allowing time for adjustment. This approach did not eliminate difficulty, but reduced its disruptive potential, preserving continuity. The pace of change outside daily life began to increase subtly, yet the internal rhythm persisted. Many of us recall sensing that the world beyond our immediate experience was shifting, even as our own routines remained stable. This contrast highlighted the role of habit in shaping perception. By maintaining familiar patterns, individuals create a buffer against external acceleration. Reflection on these years reveals how deeply such buffers influence well-being. They provided psychological space, allowing individuals to process change without being overwhelmed. This space was not created intentionally. It emerged from shared practices that valued steadiness over speed. Its effects were cumulative, shaping attitudes toward time, effort, and expectation. The experience of living within this framework fostered a particular relationship with the future. Anticipation was present, but it was tempered by trust in gradual development. Plans were made, but they were held lightly, adjusted as circumstances required. This flexibility reduced disappointment, allowing adaptation without loss of direction. As the decade drew on, the accumulated weight of these practices became more apparent. They had shaped not only daily routines, but also underlying assumptions about what life required to be meaningful. Fulfillment was associated with continuity, with participation in a shared rhythm that extended beyond individual moments. Looking back, we recognize that this way of living did not arise from ideal conditions, but from alignment between social structures and human capacities. It allowed people to inhabit time rather than chase it, to engage with life without constant urgency. This alignment did not guarantee happiness, but provided conditions under which meaning could emerge steadily. The memory of that alignment remains instructive. It reminds us that pace is not merely a function of external demand, but a shared agreement about how time is valued. During those years, such agreements operated quietly, reinforced through daily practice rather than formal declaration. Their power lay in their subtlety, in their ability to shape experience without drawing attention to themselves. In recalling the steady rhythm of that period, we are reminded of a form of living that felt natural precisely because it did not need to be defended or explained. Its influence endures not as nostalgia, but as a reference point, illuminating the quiet conditions that once allowed life to follow a more human pace, and inviting reflection on how such conditions might be recognized, if not replicated, in later times. As the sense of continuity carried on, many of us became increasingly aware that our relationship with time was shaped less by intention than by environment. We lived within structures that quietly encourage patience, and this patience, in turn, influenced how we perceive both ourselves and others. Time was not something to be conquered or optimized, but something that accompanied us, moving forward at a pace that rarely demanded justification. Daily life retained a certain predictability, yet this predictability did not feel confining. On the contrary, it offered reassurance. Knowing what to expect allowed attention to relax, making room for subtle variation. We learned to notice small changes precisely because the broader framework remained stable. A slight shift in routine, a new tone in a familiar voice, a change in weather patterns. These details stood out against a background of consistency. This attentiveness extended into social life. We observed one another closely, not out of scrutiny, but out of familiarity. Changes in behavior or mood were noticed because people were present to one another in unremarkable ways. Concern expressed itself quietly, through gestures and timing rather than explicit inquiry. Support often arrived without being requested, guided by an intuitive understanding developed through shared experience. The passage of time within relationships was marked by accumulation rather than milestones alone. Trust deepened gradually, shaped by countless small interactions that confirmed reliability. Disagreements, when they occurred, were absorbed into the larger fabric of relationship, rarely threatening its continuity. The expectation that relationships endure beyond individual moments fostered resilience, allowing connections to withstand strain. Within this context, memory functioned not as a static record, but as a living process. Past experiences inform present choices subtly, shaping expectations and responses. We did not constantly revisit the past, yet remain close at hand, integrated into daily life through habit and perspective. This integration allowed experience to accumulate meaning over time rather than remaining isolated. The rhythm of work continued to play a significant role in shaping this accumulation. Tasks repeated over years developed a sense of familiarity that supported competence and confidence. Mastery was not pursued aggressively. It emerged naturally through sustained engagement. The absence of constant evaluation allowed individuals to grow into their roles, deepening understanding without pressure. The pace of professional life reinforced a long view of progress. Careers unfolded over decades rather than phases, encouraging patience and persistence. Setbacks were understood as part of a larger trajectory rather than definitive judgments. This perspective reduced anxiety, allowing individuals to remain engaged even during periods of uncertainty or transition. Leisure continued to complement work, providing balance rather than escape. Free time was valued for a capacity to restore rather than distract. Activities chosen during these moments often reflected continuity rather than novelty, reinforcing familiarity. Pleasure was derived from repetition, from returning to activities that had proven satisfying over time. The environment supported this balance through its stability. Public and private spaces retained their character, evolving slowly rather than being constantly redesigned. This stability allowed individuals to form attachments, grounding experience in place. Over time, these places became associated with memory, reinforcing a sense of belonging that extended beyond immediate circumstance. As individuals moved through different stages of life, this sense of belonging provided continuity. Transitions were navigated within an existing framework of relationship and routine, reducing disruption. Identity evolved gradually, shaped by accumulated experience rather than abrupt change. This gradualism supported emotional stability, allowing individuals to adapt without feeling disoriented. The collective nature of experience remained central. Shared routines and expectations created a sense of mutual understanding that extended across differences. Even when opinions diverged, the underlying commitment to continuity provided common ground. Disagreement unfolded within boundaries shaped by respect and familiarity, preserving social cohesion. The pace of information exchange continued to encourage reflection. News and ideas circulated slowly enough to be absorbed thoughtfully. Discussion unfolded over time, moderated by context and shared experience. This gradual processing allowed perspective to develop, reducing the likelihood of reactive judgment. Understanding was shaped collaboratively through conversation and reflection. Waiting remained an accepted part of this process. Delays were integrated into daily life, providing space for anticipation and adjustment. Rather than being experienced as obstacles, they were understood as natural intervals within which life continued to unfold. This acceptance reduced frustration, allowing individuals to remain present even amid uncertainty. The cumulative effect of these practices shaped a particular orientation toward the future. Expectations were grounded in continuity rather than disruption. While change was acknowledged as inevitable, it was not anticipated with urgency. Plans were made with flexibility, allowing adaptation without loss of direction. This approach fostered confidence rooted in experience rather than control. As the decade progressed, subtle signs of acceleration appeared beyond daily routines. New influences began to press in from outside, hinting at shifts in pace and expectation. Yet within the established framework of daily life, these influences were absorbed gradually. Habit and routine acted as stabilizing forces, moderating the impact of change. Memory, reflecting on this period, highlights the quiet effectiveness of such moderation. The absence of constant urgency allowed individuals to remain oriented, even as circumstances evolved. This orientation was not achieved through resistance to change, but through continuity of practice. Life moved forward, but it did so without severing its connection to what had come before. The sense of adequacy that emerged from this continuity remains significant. It reminds us that meaning does not always require intensity or speed. It can arise from sustained engagement, from the quiet accumulation of experience shaped by repetition and care. This realization carries weight precisely because it was not articulated at the time. It was lived rather than explained. In recalling these years, we recognize how deeply this way of living influenced our expectations of time and attention. It shaped how we responded to challenge, how we evaluated progress, and how we understood fulfillment. These expectations did not disappear as circumstances changed. They continued to inform perspective, providing a reference point amid later acceleration. The memory of that reference point invites reflection rather than judgment. It allows us to see how life once unfolded within a pace that felt aligned with human capacities. This alignment did not eliminate difficulty, but provided conditions under which difficulty could be faced without constant strain. As we continue to reflect, the enduring impression is one of steadiness. Life moved forward not through dramatic leaps, but through sustained continuity. This steadiness shaped experience quietly, supporting resilience and meaning over time. In remembering it, we gain insight into the subtle forces that once allowed life to follow a more human rhythm, and into the ways such forces continue to influence us long after the circumstances that produce them have changed. As the years accumulated, many of us began to sense that the steadiness we had known was not merely a background condition, but a shaping force that had quietly influenced how we interpreted the world. It had trained our attention to move slowly, to linger, to notice. This training was never formal, never articulated, yet informed perception in lasting ways. We approached situations with an expectation of continuity, trusting that understanding would emerge through time rather than instant clarity. This expectation shaped how we met uncertainty. When questions arose, there was often a pause before response, an interval during which possibilities could be considered without pressure. The absence of immediate resolution did not provoke alarm. Instead, it was accepted as part of the process. We trusted that answers, if they came, would do so gradually, shaped by experience rather than haste. This trust softened the edges of doubt, allowing curiosity to coexist with patience. The fabric of daily life continued to reinforce this approach through its predictability. Familiar sequences of activity provided orientation, allowing the mind to settle. Within these sequences, attention could wander gently, making room for reflection. Thought did not need to be constantly directed. It followed its own rhythm, guided by the structure of routine. This freedom within structure fostered a sense of ease that was deeply internalized. Social interactions reflected a similar confidence in gradual understanding. First impressions were not treated as definitive. Relationships were allowed to unfold over time, revealing complexity through repeated contact. This patience encouraged tolerance, reducing the impulse to judge quickly. Differences were observed, considered, and integrated into a broader understanding of character. Over time, this approach fostered depth, allowing relationships to develop resilience. The shared nature of experience played a crucial role in sustaining this depth. We moved through similar days, encountered similar challenges, and relied on similar routines. This common ground reduced the need for constant explanation. Understanding was often implicit, rooted in shared context. Communication could remain economical because so much was already known. This economy of expression supported clarity without verbosity. Public life continued to be shaped by these shared assumptions. Participation did not require constant affirmation. It was sustained through presence and repetition. Institutions relied on continuity of involvement rather than continuous reinvention. Their legitimacy was reinforced through familiarity, through the sense that they belonged to the ongoing life of the community. This belonging fostered stability, even as circumstances evolved. The rhythm of the calendar continued to provide a gentle framework for experience. Annual cycles offered markers that oriented memory without dominating attention. They reminded us of passage without imposing urgency. Over time, these cycles accumulated significance, connecting present experience to past reference points. The repetition of seasons reinforced continuity, anchoring life in patterns that extended beyond individual moments. Within this framework, the experience of aging unfolded gradually. Physical changes were noticed incrementally, integrated into daily life rather than confronted abruptly. Adjustments were made quietly, guided by experience rather than prescription. This gradual adaptation allowed identity to remain coherent, evolving without rupture. The self was understood as continuous, shaped by time rather than divided by it. The relationship between effort and outcome continued to be framed by patience. Progress was recognized in small increments, often visible only in retrospect. This perspective reduced the pressure to perform constantly, allowing engagement to be sustained over long periods. Motivation was drawn from commitment rather than reward, reinforcing perseverance even when outcomes were uncertain. Leisure remained an important counterbalance to effort. Time set aside for rest or enjoyment was not sharply distinguished from the rest of life. It flowed naturally from daily rhythm. These moments were valued not for their intensity, but for their restorative quality. Familiar pleasures offered reassurance, reinforcing continuity. Over time, they became touchstones, grounding experience in repetition. The material environment continued to reflect and reinforce these values. Objects remained in use long enough to acquire history, becoming markers of time rather than symbols of novelty. Where it was not hidden, it was accepted as evidence of use. This acceptance fostered a sense of continuity, reminding us that durability mattered more than appearance. Care and maintenance were integrated into daily life, reinforcing attentiveness. As change began to gather momentum beyond the immediate sphere of daily life, the contrast between external acceleration and internal steadiness became more apparent. Many of us sensed this shift without fully articulating it. We noticed differences in tone, in expectation, in the speed at which information and influence traveled. Yet our own habits continued to provide a stabilizing force, moderating the impact of these changes. Reflection on this period reveals how deeply such moderation shaped experience. It allowed individuals to absorb new influences selectively, integrating them into existing frameworks rather than being overwhelmed. This selectivity was not resistant. It was discerning. It preserved continuity while allowing adaptation, maintaining coherence amid change. The collective memory of earlier years continued to inform this discernment. Past experiences provided context, helping to evaluate new developments. We compared not in order to judge, but to understand. This comparative perspective reduced anxiety, allowing us to locate ourselves within a longer narrative. The past served as a reference point, offering perspective rather than constraint. The sense of belonging fostered by this continuity extended into the future. We anticipated change with curiosity rather than fear, trusting that adaptation would occur as it always had, through gradual adjustment. This trust did not eliminate uncertainty, but it provided a stable foundation from which to face it. Confidence arose not from certainty, but from familiarity with change itself. As the decade drew closer to its end, the accumulated weight of these experiences became more visible. We recognized, perhaps for the first time, that the way we had lived had shaped us profoundly. The pace we had known had trained us to value presence, patience, and continuity. These values were not abstract ideals. They were embodied habits, woven into daily life. In remembering this, we do not seek to isolate the period as exceptional. Rather, we recognize it as part of a longer continuum, shaped by conditions that allowed human capacities to align with social structures. This alignment fostered a sense of adequacy, reducing the need for constant acceleration. Life moved forward steadily, carrying meaning through repetition. The memory of the steadiness remains instructive. It reminds us that attention thrives in environments that allow time to unfold naturally. It suggests that understanding deepens when given space to develop. These insights emerge not as conclusions, but as recognitions shaped by reflection on lived experience. As we continue to look back, the image that persists is one of quiet coherence. Life was not without challenge, but it unfolded within a rhythm that supported engagement without exhaustion. This rhythm did not demand acknowledgement. It operated quietly, shaping experience from within. In recalling this, we gain perspective on how pace influences meaning. We see how continuity supports resilience, how patience fosters understanding, and how shared habits create stability. These observations do not prescribe a return to the past, but they illuminate the conditions under which life once followed a more human rhythm, offering insight into the enduring relationship between time, attention, and lived experience. As the period drew nearer to its close, many of us sensed that the quiet continuity we had lived within was beginning to reveal itself more clearly, not because it was ending abruptly, but because contrasts were becoming easier to perceive. The steady rhythm that had once seemed unremarkable now stood out gently against emerging signs of acceleration. This awareness did not arrive as alarm, but as recognition, a subtle noticing that the conditions shaping daily life were slowly shifting. Yet even as this recognition grew, daily routines continued to provide orientation. The familiar structure of mornings and evenings, of work and rest, remained largely intact. These routines acted as anchors, holding experience steady while the broader environment evolved. We continued to move through our days with a sense of coherence, guided by habits that required little conscious effort. This coherence offered reassurance, allowing us to observe change without feeling compelled to react immediately. The ability to observe without haste became increasingly valuable. We had been shaped by years of living within a pace that encouraged reflection, and this capacity remained with us. When new influences appeared, we were inclined to watch first, to allow their implications to become clear over time. Immediate judgment felt unnecessary. Experience had taught us that understanding often arrived gradually, shaped by context rather than urgency. This approach extended into conversations about the future. Expectations were expressed cautiously, framed by an awareness of continuity. We spoke less of disruption and more of adjustment, less of replacement and more of integration. The future was imagined not as a break from the past, but as an extension of it, altered by circumstance yet grounded in familiar patterns. This imagination fostered calm, reducing the fear often associated with change. Within families, this perspective influenced how transitions were navigated. Younger generations began to encounter new possibilities, yet these were approached within an existing framework of values shaped by repetition and example. Guidance was offered indirectly, through presence and shared activity rather than explicit instruction. This approach respected individual autonomy while maintaining continuity, allowing change to unfold without severing connection. The experience of aging continued to be integrated into daily life. Physical and emotional changes were acknowledged quietly, adjusted to gradually. There was little sense of abrupt loss. Instead, there was adaptation, shaped by experience and acceptance. This gradualism supported dignity, allowing identity to evolve without rupture. Life stages blended into one another, connected by shared memory and habit. Public spaces continue to serve as sites of continuity. Familiar routes, buildings, and gathering places retain their character, providing stability amid broader change. These environments held memory collectively, reinforcing a sense of belonging that transcended individual experience. Even as new elements appeared, the underlying structure remained recognizable, allowing attachment to endure. The flow of information, though beginning to quicken, was still mediated by routine. News was absorbed within a familiar rhythm, discussed and reflected upon rather than consumed continuously. This mediation allowed perspective to develop, reducing the sense of immediacy. Understanding remained a shared process, unfolding through conversation and reflection rather than reaction. The values that had been absorbed through years of repetition continued to guide behavior. Courtesy, patience, and restraint remained embedded in daily interaction. These values did not require articulation. They were enacted through timing, tone, and attention. Their persistence reinforced continuity, shaping experience even as circumstances evolved. Work life, too, reflected this persistence. Roles and responsibilities continue to be approached with a long view, emphasizing durability over speed. Effort was sustained through commitment rather than pressure. Even as new expectations emerged, the underlying ethic of perseverance remained influential, providing stability amid adjustment. Leisure retained its restorative function. Time away from obligation continued to be valued for its capacity to renew rather than distract. Familiar activities offered reassurance, reinforcing continuity. These moments of rest supported resilience, allowing individuals to engage with change without exhaustion. The material world continued to bear the marks of time. Objects carried history, reminding us of continuity through use. Repair and maintenance remained part of daily life, reinforcing attentiveness and care. This relationship with material things supported patience, countering the impulse toward constant replacement. As contrast became more apparent, reflection deepened naturally. We found ourselves considering not only what was changing, but what had shaped us to meet change in a particular way. The steadiness we had known had cultivated a capacity for patience, for sustained attention, for gradual understanding. These capacities did not disappear as circumstances shifted. They continued to inform perception. The memory of earlier years remained close, not as nostalgia, but as context. It provided reference points that helped situate present experience within a longer narrative. This narrative reduced disorientation, allowing us to recognize change as part of an ongoing process rather than an abrupt departure. The past offered perspective, reminding us that adaptation had always occurred through gradual adjustment. The sense of continuity that emerged from this perspective fostered confidence. We trusted that life would continue to unfold, shaped by both persistence and change. This trust did not eliminate uncertainty, but it softened its impact, allowing curiosity to coexist with caution. The future was approached with measured expectation rather than urgency. As the decade moved toward its end, the cumulative influence of these habits became more evident. We recognized, perhaps more clearly than before, that the pace at which we had lived had shaped our understanding of meaning. It had taught us to value presence over speed, continuity over novelty, depth over immediacy. These values were not abstract ideals. They were embodied through years of lived experience. In reflecting on this, we do not isolate the period as exceptional. Instead, we recognize it as part of a continuum shaped by conditions that allowed human capacities to align with social rhythms. This alignment fostered a sense of adequacy, enabling life to unfold without constant acceleration. Meaning emerged gradually, carried by repetition and shared practice. The awareness of this alignment grew gently, without urgency. It invited reflection rather than judgment, allowing us to see how pace influences perception, how continuity supports resilience. These insights did not demand action. They simply clarified understanding. They helped us recognize what had quietly sustained us over time. As we prepare to move further into new conditions, this understanding remained with us. It informed how we interpreted change, how we measured progress, and how we defined fulfillment. The steady rhythm we had known continued to echo within us, shaping expectations even as circumstances evolved. In remembering these years, we are reminded that life once followed a more human pace without calling attention to itself. Its influence was subtle, embedded in habit and routine. That influence endured, carrying forward into new contexts, offering a quiet foundation upon which later experience would rest. As the period settled into memory, many of us came to understand that what we had lived through was not defined by a single decade alone, but by a way of inhabiting time that left a lasting imprint. The closing of those years did not arrive as an ending in the conventional sense. There was no clear line separating what had been from what would come next. Instead, the rhythm we had known continued quietly within us, shaping perception long after circumstances began to change. What endured most strongly was a particular relationship with time itself. We had learned, without instruction, that time could be trusted. It did not need to be chased or compressed to be meaningful. Days that unfolded calmly, marked by repetition and familiarity, proved capable of carrying depth. This trust remained with us, influencing how we approached later moments of uncertainty and acceleration. The memory of ordinary days became especially significant, not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed how meaning could arise from continuity. We remembered mornings that resembled countless others, afternoons shaped by steady activity, evenings that closed gently. These recollections formed a kind of internal landscape, one that could be revisited not as escape, but as orientation. As the world beyond our immediate routines began to shift more visibly, this internal landscape offered stability. We recognized change more readily because we had known steadiness so well. Contrast sharpened awareness, allowing us to perceive acceleration without being entirely carried by it. The habits we had absorbed continued to act as anchors, grounding attention even as pace increased elsewhere. The values shaped through repetition remained influential. Patience, once practiced unconsciously, became a conscious resource. The ability to wait, to observe, to allow understanding to emerge gradually proved invaluable. These capacities were not tied to a particular era. They traveled with us, informing how we responded to new demands and expectations. Relationships, too, bore the imprint of those earlier rhythms. The trust built through consistency endured, allowing connections to persist even as modes of interaction evolved. We carried forward an understanding that presence mattered more than frequency, that depth developed through time rather than immediacy. This understanding softened transitions, preserving continuity within change. The sense of belonging cultivated through shared routines extended beyond specific places or practices. It became an internal reference point, shaping how we located ourselves within broader contexts. Even when environments changed, the memory of belonging informed our expectations, reminding us that connection could be built gradually through repetition and shared experience. Work and responsibility continued to be approached with a long view. The ethic of endurance we had learned did not disappear. It adapted. We remained inclined to measure progress through sustained effort rather than rapid outcome. This inclination provided balance, countering pressures toward constant acceleration. It allowed engagement to remain meaningful over extended periods. Leisure, too, retained its restorative role. The memory of unhurried moments reinforced the importance of rest that truly restored. Familiar pleasures continue to offer grounding, reminding us that enjoyment did not require constant novelty. This memory helped preserve balance, even as demands multiplied. The material world, though changing, still evoked earlier lessons. Objects that had endured reminded us of the value of care and maintenance. Even as replacement became easier, the habit of stewardship persisted, shaping how we related to possessions. This habit fostered patience, reinforcing continuity amid change. As years passed, reflection deepened naturally. We found ourselves considering not only how life had changed, but what had shaped our capacity to adapt. The steadiness we had known had cultivated resilience, enabling us to navigate transition without losing orientation. This resilience was quiet, rooted in habit rather than strategy. The collective memory of that time continued to circulate through conversation and silence alike. It did not need to be preserved deliberately. It lived on through attitudes, expectations, and responses. Younger generations encountered its influence indirectly, through example rather than explanation. In this way, continuity extended beyond direct experience, shaping perspectives quietly. Looking back, we recognize that the pace of life we had known was not accidental. It reflected conditions that allowed human attention, energy, and understanding to align with daily demands. This alignment did not remove difficulty, but it reduced strain, allowing life to be lived with a sense of adequacy. Meaning emerged not through intensity, but through sustained engagement. The recognition of this alignment did not produce longing for return. Instead, it fostered appreciation. We understood that each period carries its own rhythms, shaped by circumstance. What mattered was not replicating the past, but recognizing the qualities that had once supported well-being. These qualities, patience, continuity, presence, remained relevant, even as context shifted, as memories settled. The dominant impression was one of gentle coherence. Life had unfolded without constant urgency, allowing individuals to inhabit their days fully. This coherence did not demand attention. It operated quietly, shaping experience from within. Its influence endured precisely because it had been lived rather than declared. In reflecting on that era, we came to see how deeply pace influences perception. A slower rhythm allowed observation, reflection, and connection to develop naturally. It supported understanding without forcing it. This insight emerged not as conclusion, but as recognition, shaped by distance and experience. The legacy of those years was not contained in specific practices or customs alone, but an orientation toward time. It taught us that life could move forward steadily, without haste, and still carry depth. This lesson remained with us, informing how we interpreted later acceleration and complexity. As we moved further into new conditions, this orientation provided balance. It reminded us that meaning does not require constant stimulation, that continuity can sustain engagement over time. Even when circumstances change rapidly, the memory of steadiness offered perspective, allowing us to remain grounded. In the end, what endured most was a sense of trust. Trust in time, trust in gradual understanding, trust in the capacity of ordinary life to carry significance. This trust had been cultivated quietly through years of repetition and shared experience. It did not depend on preservation. It lived on through habit and attitude. The 1960s, remembered in this way, stand not as an isolated chapter, but as part of a longer human story, a story shaped by rhythms that once aligned closely with human needs, allowing life to follow a pace that felt natural. That pace did not announce itself. It simply carried people forward. In remembering it now, we do not seek to measure it against the present. We observe it, reflect on it, and recognize its influence. We understand that time once moved in a way that allowed attention to settle, relationships to deepen, and meaning to accumulate quietly. That understanding remains valuable. It reminds us that beneath the surface of change, there are enduring principles that shape experience. Principles rooted in continuity, patience, and presence. These principles do not belong to any single era. They emerge whenever conditions allow life to unfold without unnecessary haste. And so the memory rests not as longing, but as awareness. Awareness of how life once followed a more human pace, and of how that pace shaped those who live within it. Awareness that continues to inform perception, offering a quiet counterpoint to acceleration, and a lasting reminder that meaning often grows most steadily when time is allowed to move gently forward.